Picture this: 50,000 voices screaming in unison, the roar so deafening it could be heard miles beyond the city walls. The smell of blood and fear hanging thick in the scorching Mediterranean air. In the center of a massive stone arena, a human being faces their final moments, not in the privacy of execution, but as the star performer in Rome's greatest entertainment spectacle. This isn't some Hollywood fantasy or dramatic exaggeration. This was Tuesday afternoon in ancient Rome. While we remember the Roman Empire for its magnificent architecture, brilliant legal systems, and philosophical achievements, there's a darker truth that history books often gloss over. The same civilization that gave us roads, aqueducts, and democratic principles also perfected the art of turning human suffering into mass entertainment. Today, you're going to discover the most shocking, most disturbing, and most unbelievable spectacles that ancient Rome staged for public amusement. These weren't isolated incidents of madness or spontaneous acts of violence. They were carefully orchestrated, government-sponsored events that drew crowds larger than modern football stadiums. They were planned, budgeted, and advertised like any other form of entertainment. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about one of history's greatest civilizations. Because when we peel back the layers of romantic mythology and Hollywood glamorization, we find something far more complex and infinitely more disturbing than anything fiction could imagine. The amphitheaters of Rome weren't just buildings. They were factories of death, operating on an industrial scale that would make modern minds reel in horror. Over the course of 4 centuries, historians estimate that more than 400,000 people lost their lives in Roman arenas across the empire. That's an entire city worth of human beings, erased for the sake of public entertainment. But numbers alone don't capture the true horror of what happened in these stone monuments to cruelty. The sheer creativity with which Romans devised new forms of suffering, the bureaucratic efficiency with which they organized mass slaughter, and the enthusiastic participation of ordinary citizens in these spectacles reveals something deeply unsettling about human nature itself. The Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents and encompassed 60 million people at its height. From Britain to North Africa, from Spain to Syria, Roman rule brought law, order, and civilization to vast swaths of the ancient world. Yet, in every major city across this massive territory, you would find the same architectural feature: an amphitheater designed specifically for watching people and animals die in elaborate, choreographed displays of violence. These weren't primitive societies operating on instinct and superstition. Rome possessed sophisticated engineering, advanced medicine, complex legal systems, and philosophical traditions that still influence our thinking today. Roman citizens could read and write, engage in international commerce, and participate in political debates. They built hospitals, schools, and libraries. They created art and literature that we still admire centuries later. Yet these same educated, civilized people would pack into amphitheaters every week to watch human beings torn apart by wild animals, forced to fight to the death, or executed in elaborate theatrical productions that turned murder into performance art. They brought their children to these events. They ate snacks and placed bets while watching people die. They cheered when someone was killed in a particularly creative or gruesome manner. The Colosseum in Rome could hold 50,000 spectators, making it larger than most modern sports stadiums. Archaeological evidence shows that it was packed almost daily during the height of the empire. This wasn't an occasional spectacle reserved for special occasions. This was regular programming, as routine as going to the movies is for us today. The economic scale of these operations was staggering. Rome spent more money on arena entertainment than on roads, schools, or hospitals combined. They maintained supply chains that brought exotic animals from Africa, prisoners from conquered territories, and condemned criminals from across the empire. There were professional animal trainers, specialized weapons manufacturers, and even gladiator schools that operated like modern sports franchises. The logistics alone required massive coordination. Lions had to be captured in North Africa and transported across the Mediterranean. Bears were brought down from the mountains of Eastern Europe. Criminals and prisoners of war were collected from frontier battles and marched hundreds of miles to reach the arenas. Ships, wagons, cages, handlers, guards, and countless support staff were needed to keep the death machine running smoothly. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how completely normal this seemed to Roman citizens. Contemporary writers describe attending the games the way we might discuss going to a baseball game. They complained about poor seating arrangements, criticized the quality of the gladiators, and debated the merits of different fighting styles. The systematic killing of human beings had become so routine that it was treated as just another form of consumer entertainment. The Roman philosopher Seneca attended these spectacles and recorded his reaction in writing that still chills readers today. He described how the experience of watching people die changed him as a person, making him crueler and more callous in his daily life. The violence of the arena didn't stay contained within its walls. It seeped into Roman society, shaping how people thought about life, death, and the value of human existence. This wasn't random brutality or chaotic violence. Every aspect of these spectacles was carefully designed to serve specific political and social purposes. The arena was Rome's most powerful tool for teaching obedience to its citizens and demonstrating the consequences of challenging imperial authority. When you watched a rebel or criminal torn apart by lions, you learned what happened to enemies of the state. When you cheered as someone died, you became complicit in the system that maintained Rome's power. The variety and creativity of these spectacles defied belief. Romans didn't simply execute people and call it entertainment. They transformed murder into elaborate theatrical productions, complete with costumes, props, and storylines borrowed from mythology and history. Condemned prisoners were forced to act out famous myths, knowing that their role would end in their actual death before a cheering crowd. The arena became a stage where the boundaries between reality and performance dissolved completely. Real people died real deaths while playing fictional characters in stories that audiences knew by heart. The line between execution and entertainment vanished entirely, creating something that was neither pure justice nor pure theatre, but a horrifying hybrid of both. As we delve deeper into the specific spectacles that Romans devised for their entertainment, prepare yourself for revelations that will challenge your understanding of human civilization itself. These weren't the actions of barbarians or primitive societies. These were the deliberate choices of one of history's most advanced cultures, made by educated people who understood exactly what they were doing and why. The transformation from private execution to public entertainment began with what Romans called funeral games. In the 3rd century before Christ, wealthy families would honor their deceased relatives by forcing slaves to fight to the death at graveside ceremonies. What started as a religious ritual quickly evolved into something far more sinister, as politicians recognized the power of blood spectacles to win public favor. The progression from small-scale funeral combat to massive arena spectacles reveals how quickly societies can normalize extreme violence when it serves the interests of those in power. Each generation of Romans inherited these traditions and expanded upon them, adding new elements of cruelty and spectacle until the simple act of watching people die became the empire's favorite pastime. The psychological mechanisms that allowed ordinary Romans to enjoy these spectacles tell us something profound about human nature and the power of cultural conditioning. These weren't inherently evil people who delighted in suffering for its own sake. They were products of a society that had gradually redefined murder as entertainment, cruelty as justice, and mass killing as civic duty. Duty. What emerges from studying these spectacles is a chilling understanding of how systematically Rome engineered human suffering for maximum entertainment value. The gladiatorial combats that most people imagine when they think of Roman arenas were actually just one component of a much more complex and disturbing entertainment ecosystem. The morning hours of arena events were typically reserved for what Romans euphemistically called hunts. These weren't sporting competitions between skilled hunters and dangerous prey. They were choreographed massacres where exotic animals, many already weakened by starvation and abuse, were slaughtered in elaborate displays designed to showcase Roman dominance over the natural world. Imagine waking up in ancient Rome to discover that today's entertainment would feature the systematic killing of dozens of lions, bears, leopards, elephants, and creatures that most Romans had never seen before. The sheer scale of animal slaughter was breathtaking in its magnitude. During the 100-day celebration that marked the Colosseum's opening, more than 9,000 animals died for the amusement of the crowds. But even this industrial-scale killing wasn't random or chaotic. Roman organizers understood that spectacle required narrative, that audiences needed more than simple slaughter to remain engaged. So they created elaborate scenarios where different species were pitted against each other in combinations designed to maximize suspense and visual impact. Bears were chained in underground chambers and goaded into fury before being released into the arena. Lions were deliberately starved to increase their aggression toward any moving target. Elephants, those massive symbols of exotic power, were tormented until they became frenzied, then released to rampage through carefully arranged obstacle courses while spectators placed bets on how much destruction they would cause. The logistics of maintaining this constant supply of exotic animals revealed the true reach of Roman power and the depths of their commitment to arena entertainment. Entire ecosystems across North Africa and the Middle East were stripped of their predator populations to feed Rome's insatiable appetite for novel forms of death. Professional animal hunters, called venatores, developed techniques for capturing and transporting creatures across vast distances. Specialized ships were designed with reinforced holds to carry caged lions across the Mediterranean. Caravans of handlers, guards, and support staff moved constantly across the empire's frontiers, collecting the raw materials for Rome's death industry. The environmental impact was devastating and permanent. Species that had existed for millennia were hunted to extinction or pushed to the brink of disappearance simply to provide variety for Roman audiences who had grown bored with conventional forms of killing. The appetite for novelty drove hunters to venture deeper into unexplored territories, bringing back creatures that Romans had never imagined could exist. Yet even as they marveled at the diversity of life their empire could command, Romans showed no interest in preserving or studying these animals. They existed solely to die in spectacular fashion, their deaths serving as proof of Rome's ability to reach into the farthest corners of the world and extract whatever it desired for its own purposes. The midday hours brought a different kind of horror entirely. This was when the arena transformed from a hunting ground into an execution chamber, but executions unlike anything the world had seen before or since. Romans had discovered that simple killing was insufficient for their entertainment needs. Death had to be theatrical, symbolic, and educational all at once. Condemned criminals, prisoners of war, and slaves were brought into the arena not simply to die, but to participate in their own destruction as performers in elaborate mythological reenactments. These weren't mercy killings or quick executions. They were carefully scripted dramas where real people acted out famous stories from Roman mythology, knowing that their roles would end in their actual deaths before a cheering audience. The creativity with which Romans devised these execution spectacles reveals a level of systematic cruelty that defies comprehension. Prisoners were dressed as mythological figures and forced to perform the stories that every Roman citizen knew by heart, except that when the myth called for the character's death, the actor actually died on stage. One of the most horrifying examples involved prisoners forced to portray Orpheus, the legendary musician whose songs could charm wild beasts. In the myth, animals sat peacefully enchanted by his music. In the arena, a prisoner would be given a lyre and placed in the center of the sand while a starved bear or lion was released. The doomed musician would attempt to play, while the audience watched to see how long he could perform before being torn apart. Another ghastly spectacle forced condemned men to play Icarus, the mythological figure who flew too close to the sun and fell to his death. Roman engineers constructed crude flying apparatus and launched prisoners from great heights, their inevitable crashes serving as both execution and entertainment for crowds who cheered at each impact. Perhaps most disturbing were the executions designed around the myth of Pasiphae, the queen who was said to have mated with a bull. Roman craftsmen built mechanical devices that allowed them to stage these mythological unions using condemned women, combining execution with sexual humiliation in displays that violated every principle of human dignity. These weren't isolated incidents of madness or spontaneous acts of cruelty. They were carefully planned productions that required extensive preparation, skilled craftsmen to build the necessary apparatus, and detailed coordination between multiple departments of the Imperial entertainment bureaucracy. Someone had to design the flying machines. Someone had to train the animals. Someone had to write the scripts that turned ancient stories into modern executions. The audience's reaction to these spectacles tells us something even more disturbing about Roman society than the spectacles themselves. Contemporary accounts describe crowds laughing, cheering, and placing bets on the details of how each execution would unfold. Parents brought their children to watch people die in these elaborate theatrical productions. Vendors sold food and drinks while human beings were torn apart or burned alive just a few yards away. The normalization of this extreme cruelty required a complete redefinition of what it meant to be human. Romans had to learn to see condemned prisoners not as fellow human beings, but as props in an entertainment production. The systematic dehumanization that made these spectacles possible didn't happen overnight. It was the result of generations of cultural conditioning that gradually erased the natural human revulsion at watching others suffer. Roman writers and philosophers occasionally expressed discomfort with the brutality of arena spectacles, but their criticisms were typically focused on the effect that watching violence had on the spectators rather than on the suffering of the victims. The prisoners and slaves who died in these productions were considered to have forfeited their humanity through their crimes or their social status. Their deaths served a greater purpose in maintaining social order and demonstrating the consequences of challenging Roman authority. But the arena's capacity for innovation in cruelty seemed limitless. As audiences grew accustomed to conventional executions, organizers constantly sought new ways to surprise and shock their customers. They developed increasingly elaborate mechanical devices for killing people in novel ways. They imported exotic methods of execution from conquered territories and adapted them for arena use. They combined different forms of death into spectacular productions that merged multiple mythological stories into single events. The afternoon hours typically featured the gladiatorial combats that modern people associate most closely with Roman entertainment. But even these supposedly honorable duels between trained warriors were far more complex and disturbing than popular imagination suggests. The romantic notion of skilled fighters meeting in fair combat was largely a fiction created by later writers who wanted to find something noble in Rome's appetite for bloodshed. In reality, gladiatorial contests were carefully choreographed productions designed to maximize drama and minimize fairness. Fighters were matched not according to skill or experience, but according to what combination would create the most entertaining spectacle for the audience. Veterans were pitted against novices, heavily armed warriors against prisoners with wooden weapons, single fighters against multiple opponents. The weapons and armor used by different types of gladiators were specifically designed to create visual drama rather than fair fighting conditions. Some gladiators fought with nets and tridents while wearing minimal armor, making them fast but vulnerable. Others were encased in heavy protective gear but given weapons that were difficult to wield effectively. The mismatched equipment ensured that fights would be unpredictable and visually exciting, rather than displays of martial skill. The training schools that produced gladiators operated more like modern entertainment companies than military academies. Fighters were valuable investments who represented significant financial commitments from their owners. But this economic interest in preserving gladiators' lives was constantly balanced against the audience's demand for spectacular deaths. The most successful gladiator schools were those that could produce fighters who would put on exciting shows while occasionally dying in memorable fashion. Even the famous thumbs up or thumbs down gestures that supposedly determined whether a defeated gladiator would live or die were more complex than popular culture suggests. The decision was ultimately made by the sponsor of the games, typically a wealthy politician seeking to win public favor. A gladiator's fate depended not on the quality of his performance, but on the political calculations of his sponsor and the bloodthirstiness of the particular audience. The economic incentives that drove the gladiatorial system created perverse situations where human life became a commodity to be bought, sold, and consumed for entertainment. Successful gladiators could become celebrities, earning money and admiration from fans who simultaneously demanded their eventual destruction. The contradiction between celebrating these fighters as heroes while demanding their deaths reveals the psychological complexity of Roman attitudes toward violence and entertainment. But gladiatorial combat represented only a fraction of the human cost of Roman arena entertainment. The vast majority of people who died in amphitheaters across the empire were not trained fighters who had chosen their fate, but condemned criminals, prisoners of war, and slaves who were forced to participate in spectacles designed to ensure their deaths while providing maximum entertainment value for the paying customers. The distinction between different categories of arena victims reveals how Romans used entertainment to reinforce social hierarchies and political messages. Gladiators, despite their low social status, were at least recognized as performers who possessed some skill and agency. Condemned criminals were treated as completely expendable props, whose deaths served as moral instruction for the audience. Prisoners of war died as symbols of Roman military superiority and the fate that awaited any group foolish enough to resist imperial expansion. The careful categorization of victims and the specific ways they were killed sent clear messages about Roman values and power structures. Citizens who violated Roman law died as criminals, their executions serving as warnings to potential lawbreakers. Foreigners who resisted Roman conquest died as enemies, their defeats demonstrating the futility of opposing imperial might. Slaves died as property, their lives and deaths entirely subject to their owners' whims and the audience's entertainment needs. These distinctions mattered because they helped ordinary Romans maintain psychological distance from the victims while still enjoying their suffering. By creating elaborate justifications for why different groups deserved to die in different ways, Roman society could indulge its appetite for violence while maintaining the fiction that these spectacles served higher moral and political purposes. The transformation of mass killing into popular entertainment required more than just the willingness to watch people die. It demanded the creation of entire cultural frameworks that redefined murder as justice, cruelty as entertainment, and systematic dehumanization as civic virtue. The engineering marvels that made these spectacles possible reveal just how deeply Rome had committed itself to perfecting the machinery of death. Beneath the Colosseum's arena floor lay a labyrinthine network of tunnels, chambers, and mechanical devices that modern archaeologists are still discovering and documenting. This underground world, known as the Hypogeum, was a technological masterpiece devoted entirely to facilitating human suffering on an unprecedented scale. Elaborate elevator systems, powered by counterweights and pulleys, could lift caged animals, condemned prisoners, or elaborate stage props through trap doors directly into the arena floor. The timing had to be perfect. Imagine being a condemned criminal, waiting in darkness below, hearing the roar of 50,000 voices above, knowing that at any moment the floor might open beneath your feet and thrust you into a nightmare from which there would be no escape. The hydraulic systems that could flood and drain the arena for naval battle spectacles represented some of the most advanced engineering of the ancient world. Roman architects had solved complex problems of water management, drainage, and structural integrity just to create new venues for mass killing. The same civilization that built aqueducts to bring fresh water to cities also built systems to fill amphitheaters with water so that people could die by drowning, shipwreck, or naval combat for public amusement. But the most chilling aspect of these engineering achievements was their precision and reliability. These weren't crude contraptions thrown together for occasional use. They were sophisticated machines maintained by skilled technicians and operated by trained specialists who took professional pride in their ability to deliver death on schedule. The trap doors opened at exactly the right moments. The animal cages released their contents with perfect timing. The water systems filled and drained according to precise schedules that coordinated with the day's entertainment program. The sheer scale of coordination required to stage these spectacles involved thousands of people working in carefully orchestrated roles. Animal trainers spent months conditioning beasts for specific types of performances. Weapon masters crafted specialized equipment designed to create particular visual effects when used to kill people. Costume designers created elaborate outfits that would look impressive while being torn apart by claws and teeth. Stage managers coordinated the timing of multiple simultaneous executions to maximize dramatic impact. Even the cleanup operations between different segments of the day's entertainment were choreographed with military precision. Teams of workers would rush onto the blood-soaked sand to remove corpses, drag away wounded animals, and spread fresh sand over the stains before the next spectacle began. The efficiency with which Rome could transition from one form of mass killing to another reveals how thoroughly these operations had been systematized and professionalized. The psychological preparation required to participate in these spectacles, whether as organizer or spectator, demanded a complete restructuring of normal human empathy and moral reasoning. Roman children grew up attending these events as routine family entertainment, gradually becoming conditioned to associate human suffering with pleasure and excitement. By the time they reached adulthood, the sight of people being torn apart by animals or burned alive seemed as natural as any other form of public entertainment. The social rituals surrounding arena spectacles reinforced their normalcy and respectability. Wealthy Romans competed to sponsor the most elaborate and expensive games, viewing them as investments in their political careers and social standing. The quality and quantity of deaths a politician could provide for public entertainment directly influenced his popularity and electoral prospects. Success in Roman politics increasingly depended on one's ability to organize spectacular displays of cruelty. Religious authorities blessed these events and provided theological justifications for their necessity. The deaths of criminals and enemies were portrayed as offerings to the gods, sacrifices required to maintain divine favor for the Roman state. The suffering of arena victims became sacralized, transformed from simple murder into religious ritual that served the higher purpose of maintaining cosmic order and imperial stability. Educational systems taught young Romans that these spectacles represented the natural order of civilization. Teachers explained how the arena demonstrated Roman superiority over barbarous peoples who lacked the organization and resources to stage such elaborate entertainments. Students learned that the ability to command life and death on such a massive scale was one of the defining characteristics that separated civilized Romans from primitive foreigners. The medical knowledge that Romans applied to prolonging suffering in the arena reveals another disturbing dimension of their systematic approach to cruelty. Physicians studied human anatomy specifically to understand how to inflict maximum pain while keeping victims alive as long as possible. They developed techniques for treating wounds that would allow condemned prisoners to survive multiple sessions in the arena, ensuring that popular entertainers could provide repeat performances before their eventual deaths. The pharmaceutical knowledge that went into drugging animals and humans for arena spectacles represented a sophisticated understanding of chemistry and biology applied to the goal of enhancing suffering. Stimulants were used to make animals more aggressive and unpredictable. Sedatives were employed to slow human reflexes and make victims more vulnerable to attack. Hallucinogens were sometimes administered to create bizarre behavioral effects that audiences found amusing. The breeding programs that Romans established to supply animals for arena spectacles created entire industries devoted to producing creatures specifically for violent entertainment. Professional breeders developed techniques for raising lions, bears, and other predators in captivity, selecting for traits like aggression, size, and visual impact, rather than the characteristics that would help these animals survive in their natural environments. Generations of captive-bred predators lived their entire lives in preparation for single performances that would end in their deaths. The international trade networks that supplied exotic animals and human victims for Roman arenas created economic incentives that shaped politics and warfare across the known world. Military campaigns were planned not just for territorial expansion or resource extraction, but also for their potential to provide interesting new categories of prisoners for arena entertainment. Diplomatic relationships with frontier peoples were influenced by their ability to supply novel forms of wildlife for Roman consumption. The cultural exchange that resulted from Rome's appetite for arena spectacles spread knowledge of different execution methods, torture techniques, and forms of ritualized violence across the ancient world. Roman authorities studied the practices of conquered peoples, adopting and adapting foreign methods of inflicting death for incorporation into their own entertainment systems. The arena became a laboratory where different cultural approaches to violence were tested and refined for maximum audience impact. The economic impact of arena entertainment on Roman society was staggering in its scope and distorting in its effects. Entire industries existed solely to support the death spectacles that had become central to Roman cultural identity. Specialized craftsmen produced nothing but arena equipment. Merchants dealt exclusively in exotic animals destined for slaughter. Trainers devoted their careers to preparing people and animals for public deaths. The financial resources that Rome devoted to arena entertainment exceeded the budgets for education, healthcare, infrastructure maintenance, and social services combined. Politicians bankrupted themselves, competing to stage ever more elaborate spectacles. The imperial treasury allocated enormous sums to maintain the supply chains that kept amphitheaters across the empire stocked with fresh victims and novel forms of death. The labor requirements for arena operations employed thousands of people in jobs that existed nowhere else in the ancient world. Professional executioners developed specialized skills in prolonging death for entertainment value. Animal handlers learned techniques for managing dangerous predators in urban environments. Cleanup crews perfected methods for rapidly removing large quantities of human and animal remains between different segments of the day's entertainment program. The transportation networks that moved arena supplies across the empire represented some of the most complex logistics operations of the ancient world. Caravans carrying caged predators traveled for months across deserts and mountains to reach Roman cities. Naval vessels were specially modified to transport wild animals across the Mediterranean. Professional handlers developed techniques for keeping exotic creatures alive during extended journeys while maintaining their fitness for arena performances. The storage facilities required to maintain adequate supplies of animals and human victims near major amphitheaters were massive installations that dominated the landscapes around Roman cities. Underground chambers beneath arena floors could hold hundreds of caged animals awaiting their turns to kill and be killed. Prison complexes housed thousands of condemned criminals who were being processed for various forms of execution entertainment. The training facilities where gladiators and other arena performers prepared for their roles represented significant investments in infrastructure devoted entirely to preparing people for violent death. These schools employed instructors, medical staff, equipment specialists, and administrators whose entire professional lives revolved around the business of training human beings to kill and die for public entertainment. The psychological toll that participation in arena spectacles took on Roman society became evident in the writings of contemporary observers who recorded the changes they witnessed in themselves and others. Repeated exposure to extreme violence as entertainment fundamentally altered how Romans related to suffering, death, and human dignity in their daily lives. The boundaries between entertainment and reality began to blur as people became accustomed to viewing human life as disposable spectacle. The corruption of Roman legal institutions by arena entertainment created a justice system that prioritized theatrical impact over fair trials or proportionate punishments. Judges sentenced criminals not according to the severity of their crimes, but according to what form of execution would provide the best entertainment value for upcoming games. Legal proceedings became preliminary stages in entertainment productions, rather than genuine attempts to determine guilt or appropriate punishment. The militarization of entertainment and the transformation of warfare into spectacle had profound effects on Roman military culture and imperial expansion policies. Soldiers began to view conquered enemies not as defeated opponents deserving honorable treatment, but as potential arena performers whose capture would provide valuable entertainment resources. Military campaigns were evaluated partly on their success in acquiring interesting new categories of victims for public spectacles. The religious implications of transforming mass killing into sacred ritual created theological frameworks that justified increasingly extreme forms of violence as divine requirements. Priests developed elaborate ceremonial procedures for blessing arena spectacles and interpreting the deaths of victims as omens about imperial destiny. The gods were portrayed as demanding ever more creative and spectacular forms of human sacrifice to maintain their favor toward Rome. The international reputation that Rome acquired through its arena spectacles influenced diplomatic relationships and cultural exchanges throughout the ancient world. Foreign dignitaries who visited Roman cities were expected to attend these events as demonstrations of Roman power and sophistication. The ability to stage elaborate death spectacles became a marker of civilizational achievement that Rome used to demonstrate its superiority over less developed societies. The artistic and literary works that emerged from arena culture created new genres of creative expression, devoted entirely to celebrating and documenting violence as entertainment. Poets composed verses describing famous executions and gladiatorial combats. Painters created visual records of particularly memorable arena spectacles. Sculptors crafted monuments commemorating successful games and the politicians who sponsored them. The architectural innovations that arena construction inspired influenced building techniques throughout the Roman world and beyond. The engineering solutions developed for amphitheater construction were adapted for other projects, spreading knowledge of advanced construction methods, along with the cultural values that had motivated their original development. The technology of death spectacles contributed to broader advances in Roman engineering and architecture. The medical advances that resulted from studying injuries inflicted in arena settings provided Roman physicians with unprecedented opportunities to observe human anatomy and trauma response under controlled conditions. Doctors developed new surgical techniques and pharmaceutical treatments based on their experiences treating gladiators and other arena performers. The systematic infliction of injuries for entertainment purposes inadvertently contributed to advances in medical knowledge and treatment methods. The social mobility that arena careers provided for some participants created complex relationships between exploitation and opportunity within Roman society. Successful gladiators could earn fame, wealth, and even freedom through their performances, but only by risking their lives repeatedly for public entertainment. The arena offered one of the few paths by which people of low social status could achieve recognition and material success, but at the ultimate cost of their humanity and dignity. Yet for all its sophistication and scale, the arena system contained the seeds of its own destruction. The enormous resources required to maintain these spectacles eventually became unsustainable as the empire faced mounting external pressures and internal decay. The cultural brutalization that arena entertainment produced in Roman society contributed to the moral and spiritual decline that weakened imperial institutions and social cohesion. The appetite for ever more extreme forms of spectacle created an entertainment arms race that pushed Roman society toward levels of cruelty that eventually shocked even participants and observers who had been conditioned to accept extreme violence as normal. The boundaries of acceptable entertainment kept expanding until they encompassed forms of systematic torture and degradation that challenged the basic psychological stability of the society that produced them. But the end was still centuries away, and before that collapse came to pass, Rome would devise even more elaborate and shocking spectacles that pushed the boundaries of human cruelty to their absolute limits. The transformation of Rome's arena spectacles reached its most depraved heights during the reigns of emperors who viewed the amphitheatre not merely as entertainment, but as their personal stage for demonstrating absolute power over life and death. These rulers didn't simply sponsor games. They participated directly, turning themselves into performers in their own theatres of cruelty, while forcing their subjects to witness displays of imperial madness disguised as divine authority. Emperor Caligula pioneered the concept of the ruler as entertainer, but his successors refined this approach into something far more systematic and terrifying. They understood that the most effective demonstration of power wasn't simply commanding others to kill. It was showing that the emperor himself could transgress every boundary of civilized behavior while remaining untouchable and worshipped by his people. Commodus represented the ultimate evolution of this imperial performance art. This emperor didn't merely attend the games. He descended into the arena personally, dressed as Hercules, to slaughter animals and fight gladiators in rigged contests that were as much religious ceremony as entertainment spectacle. Historical records document over 700 separate occasions when Commodus performed in the arena, each appearance costing the imperial treasury millions while reinforcing his image as a god emperor who transcended ordinary human limitations. But Commodus's arena performances weren't random acts of megalomania. They were carefully orchestrated productions designed to blur the lines between divine authority and theatrical spectacle. When the emperor killed a lion with his bare hands, audiences weren't simply watching entertainment. They were witnessing a religious ritual that demonstrated the ruler's supernatural powers. When he fought gladiators and always emerged victorious, spectators saw proof that the gods had chosen their emperor and would protect him from any mortal threat. The psychological impact of watching their supreme ruler personally participate in arena violence fundamentally altered how Romans understood the relationship between power and brutality. If the emperor himself could kill for entertainment, then violence became not merely acceptable, but sacred. The arena transformed from a place where society's outcasts died for public amusement into a temple where imperial divinity was demonstrated through ritualized slaughter. The technical innovations that supported imperial arena performances revealed new depths of Roman engineering creativity applied to the service of systematized cruelty. Mechanical devices were constructed to ensure that imperial gladiatorial contests would always end in the emperor's favor, but in ways that appeared to result from superior skill rather than rigged outcomes. Hidden springs could make an opponent's weapon malfunction at crucial moments. Concealed spikes could weaken armor without being visible to spectators. Even the sand itself was engineered to provide advantages to imperial performers while handicapping their opponents. The selection and preparation of opponents for imperial gladiatorial performances became a specialized art form that required months of careful planning. Potential challengers had to be skilled enough to provide convincing opposition, but ultimately controllable enough to ensure the predetermined outcome. They needed to appear dangerous and capable while remaining fundamentally subordinate to imperial power. The process of finding and conditioning these performers created an entire industry devoted to producing convincing but ultimately doomed opposition for emperor gladiators. The costume and weaponry designed for imperial arena performances represented the pinnacle of Roman craftsmanship, applied to theatrical violence. Emperors appeared in armor that was simultaneously functional protection and artistic masterpiece, decorated with symbols that reinforced their divine status while providing practical advantages in combat. Their weapons were perfectly balanced instruments of death that looked magnificent while remaining easy to wield effectively against deliberately disadvantaged opponents. The audience's role during Imperial arena performances was as carefully choreographed as the combat itself. Spectators weren't simply watching entertainment, they were participating in state religious ceremonies that demanded specific responses at predetermined moments. Failure to cheer appropriately or show sufficient enthusiasm for imperial performances could result in arrest, exile, or execution. The arena became a place where political loyalty was tested through forced participation in ritualized celebration of imperial violence. The international implications of imperial arena performances sent clear messages to foreign dignitaries and potential enemies about the nature of Roman power. When ambassadors from conquered territories watched their supreme conqueror personally kill animals and men for entertainment, they witnessed a demonstration of absolute authority that transcended ordinary political or military dominance. These performances declared that Rome's emperor possessed power so complete that he could transgress every boundary of civilized behavior while remaining worshipped and obeyed by millions of subjects. The religious frameworks that developed around imperial arena performances created new categories of sacred violence that pushed Roman theology into previously unimaginable territory. Court theologians developed elaborate justifications for why watching their god-emperor kill for entertainment was not only acceptable, but spiritually necessary for imperial subjects. These performances were reinterpreted as divine rituals that maintained cosmic order and demonstrated heaven's continued favor toward the Roman state. The economic costs of imperial arena performances eventually became staggering burdens that strained even Rome's vast resources. Commodus alone spent over 1 billion sestertii on his gladiatorial career, an amount that could have funded major military campaigns or massive infrastructure projects. The emperor's personal entertainment became a budget category that competed directly with essential government functions, revealing how completely arena spectacles had displaced traditional priorities of statecraft and administration. The corruption of imperial decision-making by arena priorities created situations where government policies were determined by their potential to provide interesting arena entertainment rather than their practical benefits for the empire. Military campaigns were planned partly for their ability to supply novel categories of prisoners for imperial performances. Diplomatic relationships were influenced by foreign peoples' capacity to provide exotic animals or unusual execution methods that could enhance the emperor's arena repertoire. The social dynamics that developed around imperial arena performances created new forms of court intrigue and political competition centered on access to the emperor during his gladiatorial activities. Courtiers competed for positions that would allow them to participate in planning imperial spectacles or to serve as witnesses to private arena rehearsals. The traditional aristocracy found themselves relegated to secondary roles, while former gladiator trainers and arena specialists gained unprecedented influence over imperial decision-making. The military implications of having emperors personally participate in arena violence created complex problems for Roman army leadership and imperial security. Professional soldiers struggled to reconcile their oath to protect the emperor with his insistence on exposing himself to deliberate physical danger for entertainment purposes. The Praetorian Guard developed elaborate security protocols for imperial arena appearances that attempted to eliminate risk while maintaining the appearance of genuine combat danger. The ruins of the Colosseum still stand today, weathered stone monuments to humanity's capacity for both architectural brilliance and moral darkness. Tourists walk through its corridors, marveling at the engineering genius that created such a magnificent structure. Yet few truly grasp the horror that once unfolded within those walls on a daily basis for centuries. What we've discovered today isn't simply ancient history confined to dusty academic texts. These spectacles reveal something profoundly disturbing about human nature itself. How quickly civilized societies can normalize the most extreme forms of cruelty when it serves political purposes and provides entertainment value. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed 50,000 Romans to cheer while watching people torn apart by animals continue to operate in different forms throughout human history. Rome's arena spectacles didn't collapse because Romans suddenly developed moral consciences or humanitarian concerns. They ended because the empire could no longer afford the massive resources required to maintain these elaborate death machines. The system destroyed itself through its own excess, consuming so much wealth and energy that it contributed to the broader imperial decline that would eventually bring down the entire Roman civilization. Perhaps the most chilling lesson from Rome's brutal spectacles is how completely they succeeded in their ultimate purpose, teaching absolute obedience through shared complicity in systematic violence. Every Roman citizen who cheered at an execution became an accomplice in maintaining the imperial system that demanded such displays. Every parent who brought their children to watch people die helped condition the next generation to accept cruelty as entertainment. The question that haunts us across the centuries is whether we've truly learned from Rome's example, or whether we've simply found more subtle ways to transform human suffering into mass entertainment. The capacity for systematic dehumanization that made Roman arena spectacles possible didn't disappear when the last gladiator died. It merely awaits the right combination of political pressure, economic incentive, and cultural conditioning to emerge once again in new and perhaps even more terrifying forms.